So very briefly, John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion and Professor of Law, African American Studies and Ethnic Studies, and he's our Director at Othering and Belonging Institute here at UC Berkeley. Previously, John founded and directed the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota, also the Kirwan Institute at the University of Ohio State. He also served as the Director of Legal Services in Miami, Florida, and was the National Legal Director of American Civil Liberty Union, where he was instrumental in developing educational advocacy theory. John has worked and lived in Africa, where he was a consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa. He also lived and worked in India and done a lot of work in South America and Europe. He is one of the co-founders of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and served on the board of several national organizations. John has in numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. Also, John an author and co-authored tens of articles and reports and many books, and his latest book titled Race into Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Others to Build an Inclusive Society, which is published in 2015. I'm just gonna read a very quick quote from Michelle Alexander when she reflected about this book. She said, "Few scholars today explore racial injustices with as much depth and clarity and with such fresh insight as John Powell. In this 18th enlightening essays, Powell challenges those of us who consider ourselves relatively evolved in issues of race and social justice to think far more critically about the basic assumptions and paradigms that frame our perspective, animate our scholarship, and drive our advocacy. The central questions he poses, quote, can we stop focusing simply on transactional move that we see as winnable and start working for transformation of institutions that perpetuate suffering, end of quote. And she continued to say, this question is perhaps the most important and pressing question for racial justice advocates today. Without further ado, I will give you John Powell.
Thanks, Sadiq. So it's just a demonstration that between Michelle Alexander and El Sadiq, it's always good to get your friends to introduce you. I'll try to give you as much time as possible, but I'm sure all of you know that things are heating up and changing very quickly in terms of Minneapolis and Georgia and Central Park, and that was even after the pandemic. So I've been doing some work on that today and trying to be responsive. There was a series of questions that El Sadiq posed that I want to at least try to engage. And the questions were, one, the significance politically of the moment and of the impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities. Two, the potential scenarios and how our society and the world will look as they come out of this COVID-19. And three, the Othering and Belonging Institute's doing, what is the Othering and Belonging Institute doing in responding to the immediate and long-range goals of COVID-19? So a few things. Let me say, I think we're at a powerful inflection point, probably the most powerful in recent history, maybe since the Depression or World War II. And it's a series of crises. It's not one crisis, it's a series of crises. And I'm sure you may have heard others say, maybe you heard me say that crisis comes from a Greek word, which means turning point. And that root meaning of the word sort of captures what's going on. And one of the things that's going on, you never know for sure, but it looks like we're in a transformation. It looks like we're in a paradigm shift. And it's not just a paradigm shift in California or the United States, it's the world. And you never know how a paradigm shift is going to, in which direction it's going to shift. And it doesn't necessarily have a clear ending and beginning point. One of the things that calls for a paradigm shift is that the old paradigm is failing. And you have to work harder and harder to sort of hold things together. But as they say, nature hates a vacuum. So it's not this, so we won't just have a failed paradigm and then nothing. So you're going to see competing paradigms happen at the same time that the paradigm is failing. And some people, in fact, will actually believe, whether it's COVID or other phenomena that's actually driving this paradigm shift. And I think it was already in place before COVID-19. Some people believe we can return to some earlier place. I think that's a mistake and wishful thinking. And some people believe that the right wing, if you will, will sort of capture this and make everything worse, which is a definite possibility, but not inevitable possibility. In fact, one of the things about a paradigm shift that makes them so interesting and hard is that it also sometimes calls for new grammar. So even the way that we sort of talk about things and think about things, and in my writing, I suggest it's not just a new grammar, it's actually calls for an ontological grounding. So the who we are will actually change. And we've seen this happen at different times in history, and then things settle down. And once they settle down, we sort of relax back into feeling that the way things are, they've always been, and they will always be that way. But usually the change is so slow that we can hold on to that myth. So what are some of the changes? Well, first of all, you could think our political institutions have been under stress. Our economic institutions have been under severe stress. Obviously, the planet, in terms of climate change, is powerful stresses. And those stresses get in some ways lodged in us. So look at migration patterns. The migration of the world will probably continue to expand, even though it will be uneven. You have something like 60 country walls trying to sort of hold the world. The reason that the right wing actually talks about one of the touch points, make something great again, whether it's make America, Brazil, Australia, Hungary. We're moving to a future, and that future creates tremendous unknowns, uncertainties, and the things we've put in place to sort of deal with bumps in the road don't appear to be working. And so one illusion that's very attractive is to go back to the past. And you hear that all over, especially on the right wing, but even on the left. For example, I was on a call just the other day with some progressive folks, and one of the longings was, can we go back to an agrarian age, agriculture age, where we're all farmers, we don't have to have technologies, no more Zoom calls, no more cars. And it's the idea that it would be idyllic. And the question was not a rhetorical question. The question was a serious question. And more than a question, it was an expression of a longing for a simpler life, longing for a more manageable life. And the short answer to that question is no, we can't go back. And we actually make that mistake several times. So another example of that is that sometimes people try to lift up ancient practices, whether it's African practices, Native American practices, especially of different indigenous people, European practices, and in a way where they're untranslated, bring them into solving today's problems. And it's not that those practices don't have things to teach us, but there's a book by Clifford Geer's, and the name of the book is Local Knowledge. And what he's asserting and challenging is that we can learn something and apply it all over the world at all times. And he's saying all knowledge is both local and temporal. And he's not a relativist, but he's basically saying you really have to sort of understand what's going on to actually apply knowledge. I'll make a couple other brief comments and then I'll move on or see if you have questions. One interpretation of Darwin and his powerful insight was survival of the fittest. Now, there's more than one interpretation of that. What a lot of people interpret it is that, like the fittest, those who go to the gym and work out and swim and become really strong. But it's pretty clear that Darwin wasn't meaning that, certainly in its entirety, that what he's really talking about was those who actually fit with nature. So whatever society, role, a species can adjust to nature will be what survive. And when you think about it, nature is always changing. We call it nature, we're part of nature. And therefore, it's calling on us to change. And sometimes we collectively or as a group make the change, and sometimes we don't. And when we don't survive. That was Darwin's admonition, that if you want to survive, you have to be able to adjust to the natural environment, and we could even say the social environment as it continues to change. I would say two other things. I just wrote something for the niece on this. Change is inevitable. The direction of change is not. There's some things that are going to happen. The sun's going to burn out in, another 5 billion years. We're going to get changes in the environment. Technology is going to probably continue to advance. We're going to get old and die. So changes are going to happen, right? But within that, there are changes that are unexpected and that we can't fully anticipate. And then what happens with a paradigm shift is all of a sudden those changes, instead of happening gradually, speed up. And it's hard to sort of let go and sort of start grasping for the next thing. But I want to suggest we have to do some of that and do more than grasp in terms of just grab onto the next thing. We have to create the next thing. We have to sort of reimagine the world, reimagine institutions. But then we have to also restructure. It's not enough just to think about it. It's not enough to just have a narrative about it. That's important. We are meaning-making animals. And we are animals, spiritual animals, but animals nonetheless. And those narratives are important because they help us to imagine. But it's not enough by itself, and there'll be competing narratives. And so there's the reassertion of going back to the old, the narrative of purity, the narrative of singularity, the narrative of stability. And none of those narratives will hold because you can't just have a narrative that's completely in opposition to the reality that we're facing. So it's like you can have a narrative that COVID-19 doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you won't get infected. It doesn't mean we won't get sick. It doesn't mean we won't die. So narratives by themselves don't do all the work. So what COVID has done, especially, well, really in the world, but especially in the West, is presented us with this incredible challenge and opportunity. And they're related. Because what COVID is doing is it's actually highlighting our culture, our structures, our systems, and it's saying, in a sense, as a pandemic, meaning global, it affects the entire world. And it affects the world differently, though. And if you think about most of our reactions to the pandemic, they are to cut yourself off from the world. So you shelter in place, you wear a mask, you don't shake hands, you don't visit your friends. If someone dies, you don't go to their funeral. And so it's like all of these strategies to cut ourselves off from each other. And the strategies, especially in the United States, have been failed strategies, but even around the world. So Wuhan, and certainly by December, maybe even earlier, it was clear that this virus was happening. The initial reaction to the United States was, let's stop flights from China. Let's cut ourselves off. It didn't succeed. It didn't succeed for a lot of reasons. One, some indication now is that the virus, as it came in on the East Coast, came in through Europe. So we're looking at China, and it was already present in Europe. There's some indication now that it was already in the United States in December. It may have been here since last fall. But the point of it is that it's not so easy, and the major transmission of the virus is human to human. It's not like birds or the ocean. It's human to human. And so what the virus is demonstrating is it's really hard to cut off human to human contact, even when our life depends on it. It's really hard. And so the virus both presents a thing where, in a sense, other humans are potentially a threat, right? Because every human can maybe be asymptomatic and carrying the virus. On the other hand, it's also saying, you're sort of in this together. This is not an individual thing. This is something that highlights our profound interconnectedness and sociability. And yet, we don't have systems and structures in place that reflect that. And so the inflection point is then, can we actually separate ourselves from each other in order to protect ourselves? And that's the right-wing response. And therefore, we want to get out of all of our global agreements. It challenges some form of neoliberalism that's already being challenged by the rise of Trump. It challenges air travel. It challenges a lot of stuff. The other response is, are we in this together? And if we are in this together, two things. What do we need to do to be in it together in a fair and equitable way? And two, how do we understand the differential between groups, whether it's race, age, geography, and then have a meaningful, caring, thoughtful response that reflects that. So one response is that if one group gets it at a disproportionate rate, whether they're Native Americans, whether they're disabled, whether they're Blacks, is to say, what's wrong with that group? Another is to say, what are the pre-existing conditions? What are the structures that mediate the distribution of the virus? So the virus, as they say, does not discriminate. I would accept that with some caveats, but people and institutions do. And so the virus may be, we respond to people's different situatedness is what's really powerful. And so it's not clear where we're going to land. It's not clear because we're, the oldest part of the brain, as you know, is the brains that we share with all the other mammals, which is the amygdala, which is where our emotions and particularly our fear resides. It's what some people call fear is our first emotion. And so in a heightened state of stress, it's easy to fall back into fear, to fall back into the worst instincts possible. But it's also, with some work and some help, to move into connectedness and caring, to move into love, to move into solidarity. And that's the split, where we sort of give way to fear and organize structured society stories based on that, or will we connect in terms of our solidarity, our caring, and our love? And then we will build out institutions in that way, both individually and collectively. I'll say two other things, and I'll stop on that. In the health area, there's a lot of talk about resiliency. Resiliency is important. But what people oftentimes fail to understand is that resiliency is, again, a group sport. It's not an individual sport. And our resiliency is reflective of where we're embedded and how we're embedded. So it's relational. People who are well embedded have a lot of resiliency. People who are isolated have little resiliency. And it shows up biologically, but it also shows up sociologically. So what are we doing? One, we are trying to, as you know, We've had this group called What's Next, which is a network. We're doing all the things that we were already doing, right? Because we started grappling with these issues already. They now have been amplified, and we're trying to amplify and ramp up. So for example, you probably have seen some of the maps and stuff online, which challenged us because the data was not available. And there are different ways of getting data. So for example, if they don't report, like in Florida, if they don't report the number of people dying of COVID, what you can do is look at excess death records. You can do a model, and it's like, based on what we know, so many people should die a month in any given zip code. And instead, we're having that number plus. With a plus, even if we don't know why, there's a good basis to speculate that the plus is actually people who died of the coronavirus. And so we're doing that. We're trying to lift that up. We're trying to, and we're trying to do it in a way that then not just describes what's happening, but describes what should happen in terms of interventions, in terms of prophylactics, in terms of, and understanding, again, those structures and norms and systems that make that, to create that condition in the first place. So I'll give you two other scenarios, and then I'll start pivoting toward closing so you can ask questions or comments. Most of you obviously don't really know me. You're new at the Institute. There's some people who've been around a while. I'm not an alarmist, and I'm not someone who's easily stressed. But I would say three things. One, the world will be different 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, and we will be different. So it's not, we are part of the world. We will be different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily good, but it's a possibility. That possibility is what we should be seizing on. How do we actually create the probability of that possibility? What do we need to be doing? And there are a lot of things on the table, whether it's healthcare for everyone with a minimum, whether it's working conditions for everyone that's relatively safe and paying decent wages, whether it's housing for everyone. I just sent a note to the mayor of Berkeley suggesting, for now, temporarily, and I know there's a lot of reasons why this might not happen, but what would it look like to actually create parks where people could actually, people who are unhoused could live, that they could put their, if they had tents, it would be a gradient. So some people have tents, some people have more than tents, some people have less than tents, but people would have space. And in that park, the space would be assigned. In that park, there'd be showers, there would be bathrooms, there would be 24-hour security, and you could actually segment it. So you might have one park for families, another park for women, another park for the general population. And you would limit the size, so park no more than 100. And you could do that, my guess is now, at less cost than we're paying now. And then you could actually use that as a springboard to sort of both understanding the population better and moving toward more permanent solutions. I think that's conceivable now. So one of the things the crisis does, it makes things that were inconceivable conceivable. So in that vein, we should also be looking at what I call moonshots, not just doing stuff incrementally, but if we really had the capacity to do whatever we want to create a fair world, a fairer country, what would it look like? And to free ourselves up to imagine that. There's a story, sort of a joke that I tell that by this famous American philosopher named Richard Pryor. Some of you may have heard of him. And in this scene that he's recounting. He's in court, criminal justice system, a whole another one, the police, another one. Just on a footnote, I was thinking today, could we have a society where you say, you can't police the people unless you care about the people? And because if you're policing people and you don't care about them, you get what we have. So what Richard Pryor's story is, he's in court and he's done something, didn't pay his bills, and the judge is, as they say, throwing the book at him. And the judge at one point says to Richard Pryor, would you like to say anything else before I finish your sentence? And Richard Pryor says, you've taken away my family, taken away my car, taken away my house, and taken away my freedom. What else do you want, Judge? And the judge leans over the dais and says, do you have any dreams? And I think that the thing that's really important in this space of heightened stress and uncertainty, and learning to sort of lean a little bit into that uncertainty, but also to be able to dream. But not just dream, but then build the infrastructure to make the dreams real. So that's partially what we're doing at the Institute. We don't call it dreaming because that would sound too, woo-woo or something. But we talk about moonshots. We try to get people, and then we try to do the rigorous work behind it. What would it look like? What would it be restructuring? So anyway, those are some of the ways. I think it's a good chance this is not what I would say a moment, but this is actually something that you will live with. Those of you who are in school or just coming out of school, it will actually mark your life in some ways. And unless we're careful, negative. So how do we actually make it less negative? How do we actually, and I think it would be more to be negative if we continue to try to just hobble together the existing institutions rather than creating a new set of possibilities. I'll stop there and for the next 15 or 20 minutes, hear your comments or questions.
Thank you so much, John. And please feel free, because John gonna leave, and if you have any thoughts, questions, or reflections, that's your moment. You can just unmute yourself and ask your comment.
Hello, I have a question. Thank you, John, for your reflection. I want to link what you said about the survival of the fittest with what we are seeing today with police brutality and with what is happening. And I think one of the risks of using that metaphor is that I have seen a lot of people arguing that all of the structural or all of the ways in which minority groups are being left behind because they don't adapt to nature. Is because and that's aligned with like their interpretation of what Darwin is saying, in the sense that they are not the fittest because they don't adapt to society, they don't adapt to, and so the changes is on them. And so I wanted to know if you can give us your thoughts and your reflection about how, in which way it is acceptable to request those people to change, and in which way we are addressing all of those problems with a focus on a change in institutions.
Right. That's a great question. So a couple of things. One is, just so you know, I don't like the word minority. I do use the term minoritized because of the process. And I think, not to over rely on Darwin, but Darwin's in part talking about a species. And as you may know, Darwin was somewhat controversial because he argued that there were not different races. He was one of the first people who argued that there were humans and there were different kinds of humans, but we're all Homo sapiens. And I would posit adopting to social structures is different than adopting to nature. And the social structures are designed not for people to adopt or not for people to flourish, but they're designed in a very hierarchical way. They're designed to actually exploit people. They're designed to actually extract from people. They're designed to actually colonize people. And that comes actually from a number of things, but it also comes from earlier assumption in the West in particular, that there's a hierarchy starting with God and then angels and then humans and then subhumans and then all the way down to, and that hierarchy is what's natural. And so what I think we're seeing is a reflection of that, the refusal to acknowledge that we're all interrelated, and that we're interrelated in, as Dr. King would say, in a state of radical mutuality. Then, I mean, we wouldn't have had colonialism, we wouldn't have had slavery, we wouldn't have had genocide, we wouldn't have had, patriarchy, if there wasn't already a system in place. And these systems are older than Darwin. These systems of exploiting each other has been around a long time. So the question is, can we actually live in relationship to and harmony with each other and with the earth itself, which is a pretty radical shift. I sometimes, if you think about certainly one interpretation of Genesis 1:23, God gave man dominion over the earth and all living things. So a lot of Christians have interpreted that the earth and the living things on the earth are there to be exploited for man's use. Other people say, no, we're all in relationship to each other. But it's not clear which of these we will land on in a systematic way. But when we talk about belonging, the Othering and Belonging Institute, is the idea is that we belong to the things we co-create. So it's not creating it for the dominant group or creating it for the minoritized group or the subordinate group. It's actually creating it together for all of us. And if we fail to do that, I think there's more than a decent chance our tenure on the earth will be relatively short. And I don't mean minoritized people, I mean people, period.
Other questions, reflections, comment? Go ahead.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I would like to for you to talk and maybe talk more about emotions, because for what I've seen in these moments that are like, they're very emotional, and I get. I mean, it's just like all full of emotions, but then all the calls are, no, we have to be rational, as if all the system of oppression was rational. So it's always, like this differentiation between the emotions that are, and always almost just about oppressed people, like you're too emotional, right? And then you should be rational, like us, and you can protest, but you should protest properly. So like I just feel that I don't know, I've been thinking, I don't even know what I'm asking, right? But it's just like this thing between emotions and rationality. But then for me, there's no rational, just to oppress people is not rational. That over and over again we've seen the same thing happening, and it's not rational just to turn the other cheek all the time, or it doesn't seem like. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
That's a great.
If I made it.
So, first of all, I think when I talked about the limbic system, which is the old system. This is where emotions and largely fear hang out, not just there, but there. It's also bigger, it's also older, it's also faster. So when we look at the direction, from the neofrontal cortex, which is where we think most of our, what we call rational thinking takes place. From that direction back down to the emotions, there are not that many receptors, it's not very fast. The other way, from the emotions to the neofrontal cortex, there are many receptors and it happens very fast. So that means actually our emotions are influencing our, what we call our rational brain more than the other way. And much of what we call our rational brain is a fraud, because what it does is it gets an input from the emotional part of the brain and it translates it into a rational statement, right? And it's actually quite powerful. And so to be whole human beings, to your point, we have to recognize that we are emotional, we are rational, and the emotions are very old. That's what we sometimes call the animal part. And that's why I make the point that we are animals. We're not robots, we're animals. And a lot of that, we have a 2 million year history as animals, human animals. And it's only recently, in terms of quote unquote the science, that we're beginning to understand how powerful emotions are. And I'll just give you 2 quick examples. One they discovered sort of by accident. There was a guy who was injured and they had to do some surgery on his brain. And it ended up basically, the gist of it is that he could still think, but his emotions were truncated. And after a while, he was in the hospital, he got out of the hospital, he went back to work, and he could look like he could be rational. And they'd say, this happened. He had to sign a document. And he said, do you want it in red ink or blue ink or black ink? And they said, you decide. For 8 hours, he went back and forth. It's like, well, the blue ink is this, and the black ink is that. And he tried to weigh, and he couldn't reach a conclusion. And what scientists came up with is that the emotion is what actually drives the conclusions. And then we rationalize it. And when he was rationalizing without emotions, there was no conclusion. It was just spinning wheels forever. And so a lot of the stuff now coming out of the mind science have reasserted the emotions back in the picture in a much more healthy way. But I would say that's just the start, because we're rational beings somewhat, we're emotional beings somewhat, we're also spiritual beings. We haven't actually even began to explore what that means. And we are in relationship with each other. So from my perspective, to be healthy in this world, you have to be embodied in, not just in the body, but in the larger body. You have to be in relationship. You don't have a self until you have an other. You don't have a self until you have a story. Without a community, without belonging, we cease to exist. And that's part of the work that we're trying to do. And so it's not just we're not trying to be Spock. We're researchers, and there's a place for research. But we're trying to be full human beings in relationship with each other and in relationship with the earth. That's a major project. That's a huge paradigm shift, but it's a beautiful paradigm shift. And so we used to talk about rational and irrational. I would say rational and transrational. There's more, because the emotions are not just, they're not random. They're ordered, they're doing something, they're patterned. And because we didn't understand them from the rational, it's like the Greeks, when the Greeks start coming in with people who spoke other language, they call it, it's like ba, 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 because they didn't understand them. So they assumed, they're just babbling, right? But they were speaking. The Greeks didn't understand them. So part of it is for us to have a deeper relationship with what it means to be human in relationship to each other and in relationship to the earth. And that certainly requires us reclaiming. And just the last thing on this, Descartes, you may remember, he sort of the father of Western philosophy. And he had this quandary of how can I know I exist? I might be dreaming. It could all be a fiction. How can I even know I exist? And the way he solved this riddle for himself, apparently, he came up with that famous statement now, which is, the one thing I know for sure is I'm thinking, right? And that's what he came up with. I think, therefore I am. It's the fact that I'm thinking proves that I exist. He went further and had the split between the conscious, rational mind and the emotional mind. So the father of Western philosophy recognized emotions, but he didn't trust them. He couldn't control them. They were always beyond him. And so it's like the role of the rational mind, like the role of humans in relationship to Earth, is to dominate the emotions. And groups that were associated with emotions, whether they were people of color, whether they were Native Americans, whether they were women, could not be fully trusted. Those groups was considered to be less than fully human, because from Descartes on in Western society, what became fully human was those who spent basically all of their time in this narrow rational mind. And it was a huge distortion that we're still trying to get out of.
Maybe we get a last comment or question.
And I'll stay at 120 if it's necessary. If not, so any other questions or comments?
I have one. It might be kind of long though, but I was just looking at this MLK quote this morning that says, "The moral arc of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." But just reflecting on like our history and even with events today, it looks like the opposite. So I guess my question is just, how do we get there, and like what does it look like in practice to go toward justice?
Well, you know, it's sort of interesting, right? Because there are a number of treatises on what is justice. So we don't. So, I mean, King doesn't really tell us what justice is. He just tells us that the arc of the universe bends in that direction. So, in some ways, you could say we don't know, but one might posit, and there have been people who have posited in terms of looking at history. So it's like, how long do you look? Do you look 2 days, 2 years, 2 centuries, 2 millenniums? You know, so part of it is just your measurement of time. And what King would say, King was obviously a very brilliant, sophisticated person. He wasn't talking about in the short term. And he certainly would say that it's inextricably linear, right? That there won't be setbacks. But actually, I'm writing something, and I'll get it out probably next week on what's happening in Minneapolis. I lived in Minneapolis for 10 years. Let me suggest, so part of the thing I think that I try to bring to the Institute is a certain degree of nuance and even complexity. And I want to name what I think is the opposite of that, and why I think that's a problem and sometimes a challenge. Right now, we just heard about, you know, emotions, right? And we're all, most of us, I would assume, hurting and pain for what happened and how it happened. And it's a friend of mine who's at the public health school at Harvard. He's written a paper, which I'll try to circulate, which basically says every time there's a unarmed Black person killed, the Black community in that state are traumatized for at least 3 months. So it's an injury, it's terror. And that's what terrorism is. Terrorism is, that idea of terror is that terrorism is not really an act against the people who are killed. Terrorism is an act against the people who are alive. You terrorize the people who are alive. And that's the goal. I mean, it's a strategy. Like, and in a sense, that's what these are. These public killings of Black men and women is an act of terror. Maybe. Think of lynchings. Lynchings were acts of terror. It wasn't just, let's actually kill this person. They were public because you wanted to terrorize the Black community, right? But the lynchings by themselves only do some of the work. Where's the rest of the work done? The rest of the work done is in the overall society celebrating, sanctioning the lynching. And until fairly recently, I would say on most of the killings by police of Blacks in public, we've had the rest of society participating in that, not just the police. So then you have the courts. So you have all these killings with, most of the time, not even an indictment. Forget about a conviction. You can't get an indictment. Most of the time, not even an arrest. Forget about an indictment. You can't even, so, and what you've had in the past, and it's too soon to say, but what you had in the past is the establishment, particularly the white establishment, people with power, would actually put their arms around the police. They would push back against those who would challenge the police. They would then say, we need to go through this process. We're going to have a grand jury. We're going to look at this for 6 months. We're going to study it. And if they did anything to the police, they said, you get paid leave. It's like, what kind of punishment is that? You get to get paid, but you don't have to do any work. And that's a punishment? So that has been the norm for much of the last, 2 decades. That norm is broken in this instance. We had the mayor of Minneapolis come out next day saying, first of all, policemen.
John, you're breaking up. Can you repeat what you said?
Maybe a small thing, but that doesn't normally. So, but the day after, 4 police were fired. They didn't get a paid leave. They got fired. And then the mayor went on to say they should be arrested. They should, the one who was with his knee on the guy's, on George's neck, should be in jail. That may seem like nothing, but that's almost never happened before. And then when it's any indication of any outrageous behavior on the part of police and a public figure speaks, usually a Black public figure speaks out, the fraternity of officers, the police union, have always, have always then sided on the side of the police. They did not in this case. They broke with the police. Again, it may seem like a small thing, but so you have an uneven response in the establishment. Some of the establishment saying no, and some are even saying, we're not going to go through the question about emotions. We're not going to go through this protracted, deliberate process to figure out whether this was happening or not. Because usually things don't rush to judgment. We don't have all the evidence. We don't know what happened. Okay, so the video, again, reminds me of Richard Pryor again. As you can tell, I like Richard Pryor. He says, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? And so in this case, though, that's all shifted. Not all shifted, because you still have people, whites and Trump, saying, whatever. But there's some different moment. I think being on small, but I do think we should lift it up. When these things would happen I played basketball, so I like sports. But when these things would happen, and Michael Jordan was the front page of basketball, he wouldn't say a word, not a word. And when people asked him about it, he would basically say, white people and Republicans, they buy my shoes and they come to my games. And I play basketball. He was silent. Now you have LeBron James. wearing a t-shirt the next day saying, I can't breathe. It's not enough, but there's some glimmers of hope for us to build on. So what King says, I think, is probably right, but I would tweak it a little bit, because he also said time is neutral. So the arc doesn't bend by itself. We bend the arc. If it bends toward justice, it's because we bend it toward justice. And that's our challenge. And it's a challenge that's hard because we don't know if we'll win. We don't know if the arc will actually make that bend. But we do know if we don't grab it and try to bend it, it won't. The only chance it has of bending is if we do it. And so that's our challenge. And we'll know sometime in the future. Probably we won't know, but our children will know. And I'll end just by saying this. Some of you have heard me talk about my family. I love my family. I have a very close family. I'm 6 of 9 children. My family's from the South. I was 11 years old. My family would go back to the South every summer. We spend the summer in the South. I grew up in Detroit. When I was 11 years old, we went back south, and there had been a lynching. And the whole Black community was traumatized. And I was 11 years old. And I remember just saying, basically in an 11-year-old voice, what the F's going on? Why doesn't somebody do something? What? And my grandfather, I remember saying, be quiet. You know, don't. And one of his famous lines was, you better leave those white people alone. They don't play. From that day on, that year on, when my family went back to the South, I was not allowed to go. They were afraid that if they took me back, I'd get killed. And they were afraid for me. And I can say, as bad as things are, they're different than they were when I was 11 years old. You know, people aren't, you know, even my family members, but people aren't necessarily saying, I may get killed. They're saying, shut up. They're saying, you know, all of our lives are at risk, but there's a different sensibility about it. Again, a small change, but a change nonetheless. And I believe that if we do the work of the Institute, along with our friends and colleagues across the country and across the globe, we can bend that arc. And it won't always be easy, and sometimes it will go the wrong way. But I believe more often than not, with our work and our effort, it'll go the right way. So that's why I do this work, and that's why I'm really proud that you're here to help us do this work. So thank you, and I'm going to sign up and do this podcast.
Thank you so much, John. Hope to see you again and have more conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Nicole and I, we agree that we can keep this conversation to hear more your reflections on what he said and what you are thinking. You didn't have the chance to share with John. You can share with all of us. And if you have a lingering question, even if nobody answered it, it would be good to ask that question or just comment. And we will keep the platform open till 2 o'clock. Feel free if you wanna step out for whatever other obligation you have, but we will have another half an hour for this conversation. So you can start whatever who feel like it.
I wanted to say regarding to what Eliza was saying is that I also think that justice is just constant, right? Like my fight is different from my mom's fight, and I think that we should just keep fighting, right? Because like I feel that if like this notion of justice does not evolve with our struggles, then it's you know, like this argument, and so people say it's just like, yes, but you already have the right to vote. What are you complaining? Yes, but like we already gave you, as it was like a gift, this or that, so why are you complaining, right? I feel that these notions of justice like evolve with like every generation and every yeah, with the time. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Gabriela. And by the way, we don't have to have an answer for what we're thinking, because sometimes it's just I'm really big fan of this idea of, you know, raising questions sometimes is more important than actually figuring out the answer, because without the question, the brain itself doesn't work within the problem. You know, like Eliza said, you know, when this arc of justice will bend. And it's a legitimate question, because during time of frustration and struggles, always that question is present. Do I will spend all my life for nothing? And I will leave you with this anecdotal. When I was young, I joined this group called the Sudanese Youth Union. And we went for this orientation day. So we are young. I was 13 years old. We working to end female genitalia cutting in Sudan. So that was the things that we want to do. So it's huge problem. So the gentleman came, he was in my dad age, and he said, after he asked about our names and etc., he said, who want to see this practice change in their lifetime? So we all raised our hands. He said, okay, I don't think I have anything to do, I'm leaving. I was like, what happened? He get upset. So we have 5-10 minutes break, and he came back. He said, if you have just the dream that you can end this in your lifetime, you are not the one who's gonna work for social change. Literally, I was like, this guy is crazy. So we get very upset, but we continue with him. But his training was very vital, at least to me and my other friends, that we could work for social change the whole entire span of our lifetime and never happen. But to have this capacity in your heart and your brain that it will happen one day, whether I'm here or not, and that's the driving force. And I think that's most of us, that's the reason why we wake up in the morning and try to do it. You know, do I change the world with an article, with a reward, with a book, with graduating? I'm not quite sure that will happen, but without drops, we'll never. So I leave you with that. But is a good way to entertain in a time of extreme frustrations, that no matter what you do, even personal transformation is actually changing, you know, the molecule of society. Any reflection of those? Yeah, Sabrina?
Yeah, that reminded me of this tension that John was talking about like how rationality and this whole like Western Enlightenment ideal is used as part of like the white supremacist project, right? To marginalize others historically over the past few centuries, and till today, you know, basically delegitimize arguments of marginalized groups. And then in the beginning, he also talked about how, you know, this return to other ways of thinking like traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge almost can't be universally applied anymore, because we exist in a world and a reality that almost cannot allow that to happen, because we live in this highly like unequal system already rooted in these like forms of supremacy. And so, yeah, when you're talking about personal transformation, it really, I think, kind of points to this larger question of like, even in talking about things now, of because we're in this situation where we can't, like we're starting from a place of so much injustice, how do we even begin the process of paradigm shift, and what are the indicators that tell us that we're moving in the right direction? Because it's so hard to build something good from a pile of bad. Yeah.